Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that doesn't show up in history textbooks. The disgusting hygiene habits of prostitutes in medieval Europe. Everyone knows about castles, knights and plagues, but no one tells you what it was actually like inside the brothels that thrived in every town and city. And trust me, once you hear what went on, you'll never think of the romantic Middle Ages the same way again. Oh, and if you're enjoying these kinds of stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Always curious where you're listening from. So drop a comment with your location and what time it is for you. Blows my mind every time when I see people drifting off to sleep with these grim tales from all over the world. All right, get comfortable. Adjust your blanket, settle into that cozy spot and take a slow breath. Because we're heading back to a medieval town at night, and by the time we're done, you're going to be grateful for your shower, your bed, and your deodorant. So congratulations, you've just woken up in the 14th century. Outside, the streets are narrow and reeking, the gutters run with human waste, and pigs snuffle in the muck. And inside the brothel you've stumbled into, things aren't much better. The first thing that hits you is the smell. Imagine a mix of stale beer, smoke, sweat and sewage drifting in from the street. The floor is covered in straw, meant to soak up spills, not just ale but worse things, and it hasn't been changed in weeks. Rats skitter along the beams, overhead, and fleas bounce across the mattress. A filthy sack of straw flattened from use. You lie down here, pressed against wood that splinters your skin, and a blanket that reeks of mould. No one washes it. Washing anything in this world is rare. The women themselves smell like survival. Their dresses are rarely cleaned, cloth stiff with sweat, grease from meals, and the fluids of countless encounters. Water isn't safe to drink, let alone to bathe in, and no one trusts the river, clogged with waste from tanneries, butchers, and every chamber pot emptied at dawn. So instead of bathing, they mask, a splash of cheap wine rubbed on the skin, rose water if they can afford it, or the more common trick, vinegar or urine, meant to cut through odour, not erase it. The result is a sharp, sour tang that mixes with the musk of the body underneath. Hair is crawling with lice. Combs are shared, sometimes stolen from clients. Wigs, when worn, are itchy nests of fleas. To hide bald patches, women dust their scalps with powders, sometimes lead-based, sometimes flour, which only adds to the stink once sweat soaks through. And still men come. Some are drunk, stumbling from taverns, others arrive with priests' blessings. Since the church, though it condemned fornication in sermons, quietly tolerated brothels as a necessary evil. The brothel itself is a hive, cramped, filled with coughing, groaning, the occasional cry of pain. In one corner, a pot of ale is shared between workers and clients alike, everyone drinking from the same rim. In another, a woman squats to relieve herself in a bucket, barely shielded by a torn curtain. The air is thick. Oil lamps give off smoke, filling lungs with soot. Perfumes try to fight it, but the stronger smell is of bodies, unwashed, pressed together every night, in acts repeated so often they're no longer passion, just transaction. And yet, this was life. A woman with no husband, no family, or too many mouths to feed could end up here, surviving one filthy night at a time. Hygiene wasn't just bad, it was dangerous. Parasites, sores, infections spread unchecked. Doctors, when they appeared, offered mercury ointments or herbs that burned the skin more than they cured. Most women simply endured, hiding rashes under layers of wool or dousing sores in vinegar until they scabbed. This wasn't glamorous. This wasn't silk sheets or hidden courtyards. This was survival in filth, and the human body bent under it. If you think hygiene was as simple as just take a bath, you're forgetting one brutal reality of the Middle Ages. Water could kill you. Rivers doubled as sewers, carrying every chamber pot, butcher's scraps, and tannery chemicals downstream. Wells were often contaminated. Even rainwater wasn't safe. Gutters collected dirt, bird droppings, and mould before dripping into barrels. So when prostitutes wanted to clean up for their work, actual water was often the last thing they trusted. Instead, they improvised. And the results were unpleasant. Cheap wine was a common substitute for bathing. A woman might take a rag, soak it in sour wine, and rub it across her skin. The sting from the alcohol gave a quick illusion of freshness, but it did little more than spread dirt around, while leaving behind the acrid scent of spoiled grapes. Vinegar was another option. Sharp, biting, burning against sores and rashes that were already common from constant contact with unwashed clients. And then there was the most shocking solution of all: urine. Medieval people believed urine had cleansing properties. Collected in jugs and left to age until it grew potent with ammonia, it was used to bleach clothes, scrub floors, and yes, even wash bodies. Prostitutes desperate to mask their odour would rub it on their skin or even their hair, trading one smell for another. The logic was simple. Anything was better than the reek of sweat and sex that clung to them. But for anyone stepping into that brothel, the mix of vinegar, wine and urine was unforgettable. A stinging cocktail that burned your nose long before you touched the bed. Bathhouses should have been the answer, but they weren't. Known as stews, they were communal tubs of lukewarm water where dozens of people washed together. A prostitute might rinse in the same water that had just been used by a butcher, a baker, and 3 drunk men who hadn't changed their tunics in months. Imagine stepping into a tub clouded with grease, hair and pus from open sores. Whatever cleaning happened there only meant carrying someone else's filth back to the brothel. And yet, bathhouses doubled as places of business. A man could pay for a bath and company at the same time, which meant prostitutes often went from client to client without ever leaving the same cloudy pool. For their hair, things were no better. Lacking proper soap, women sometimes rubbed ashes mixed with animal fat into their scalps, hoping to absorb oils. The residue left behind only attracted lice faster. Combs, if they had one at all, were shared among everyone in the house, passing parasites from head to head. To cover the smell, powders were sprinkled, sometimes ground herbs, sometimes flour, sometimes even chalk dust. But powders caked with sweat, turning pasty and foul-smelling within hours. And don't imagine they had fresh linens to wrap themselves in afterwards. Washing clothes was costly, and laundresses often cleaned garments with the same urine-soaked method used for scrubbing floors. A prostitute might wear the same dress for weeks, stiff with layers of old sweat, dirt and other stains polite society didn't talk about. Changing clothes meant waiting for a new donation from a client, or buying rags from a pawn shop. Now put yourself there. You step into the room after a long day in a medieval town. The woman in front of you has tried her best. A splash of vinegar on her neck, wine rubbed on her arms, hair powdered with flour. She's done what she can to seem presentable. But underneath it all is the same unwashed body, the same stinking dress, and the same airless room. The fresh smell burns your nose. The mattress beneath you crawls with lice, and the candlelight flickers on a basin filled with liquid you don't dare touch. Hygiene wasn't about cleanliness, it was survival, and every trick they used, from sour wine to aged urine, only reminded anyone who walked through those doors just how impossible clean really was in the medieval world. If you want to understand medieval brothels, you have to start with the smell. Forget perfume, forget roses, forget anything pleasant. The air in these places was heavy, thick, and unforgettable. The kind of smell that clings to your clothes for days after you leave. The kind that sits in the back of your throat, no matter how much you try to cough it out. Picture this. The floor is covered in straw scattered there months ago to soak up whatever spills or leaks happened during the night. And by whatever, I mean everything. Ale from mugs, candle wax, blood from fights, waste from chamber pots that didn't make it outside, and fluids no one dared describe out loud. That straw was never swept away, only trampled down until it turned black and sticky. Underneath, the wood planks warped with moisture, attracting rats and beetles that scuttled freely, while people went about their business above. The beds weren't much better. Mattress is a generous word for what was essentially a sack stuffed with old straw. Over time, the straw inside broke down into dust, crawling with mites and fleas. Lay down for even a moment, and your skin itched from the invisible army hiding in the seams. Add in the sweat of dozens, maybe hundreds of bodies pressing into that same sack of straw, and you get a permanent smell, sour, musky, damp, and almost alive. Blankets offered no relief. They were often wool, heavy and damp with mould, stiff with crusted stains that hadn't seen a wash in months. Fleas ruled these rooms. They leapt from bedding to clothing, from prostitute to client, feeding freely. Lice burrowed into hair and seams of clothing. Every scratch, every twitch in the night wasn't from nerves. It was from bugs crawling across your body. And when one woman itched, everyone else soon followed. Flea bites left red welts, lice spread easily, carrying fevers, but none of that stopped business. Men still came, coins still clinked on wooden tables, and women still endured. The air itself was a soup. Oil lamps smoked, filling lungs with soot. Candles sputtered, releasing the stink of animal tallow. Combine that with unwashed bodies packed into rooms with little ventilation, and the brothel smelled like a mix of sweat, sex and slaughterhouse. Even priests who later condemned such places admitted that the stench of sin was unforgettable, though many of those same priests had been regular customers. Privacy was rare. Curtains or wooden partitions sometimes separated spaces, but sound travelled freely. Coughs, moans, arguments, and the wet sounds of the act itself blended into a constant hum. To someone walking in for the first time, it might feel like entering a barnyard more than a house of pleasure. Chickens sometimes wandered inside. Cats crouched in corners, chasing rats. In some districts, goats were kept nearby to provide milk, their stink mixing with the rest. And yet, this was normal. In a city where the streets reeked of open gutters, tanneries and butcher shops, brothels were only another pocket of filth. But for the women forced to live in them, the stench was inescapable. It clung to their skin, their clothes, their hair. They could powder their faces, dab vinegar on their wrists, or burn herbs in the corners, but nothing masked the smell of rot and sweat that hung in the rafters. Now imagine lying down in that room. The mattress crunches beneath you, damp straw poking through the sack. The blanket scratches your skin, heavy with mildew. Every breath fills your nose with smoke and musk. Every itch reminds you of fleas. The woman beside you forces a smile, but even she knows no amount of rosewater or wine can cover this stench. This was the reality of medieval prostitution, not luxury, not silk, just survival in a room where every corner stank of the business being done there. and where filth was as permanent as the walls themselves. When you can't get rid of the stench, you try to cover it. That was the logic in medieval brothels. True cleanliness was impossible. There was no running water, no real soap, no way to scrub the stink out of straw beds and wool blankets. So prostitutes turned to the next best thing, perfumes and disguises. But don't picture Chanel bottles or elegant sprays. These scents were rough, improvised, and often worse than the smell they were trying to hide. Rose water was a luxury, imported at great cost from the East. The wealthy could sprinkle it on their linens or dab it on their wrists. But for most prostitutes, even the cheapest vial was out of reach. A lucky few who had a generous client might get some, and they would guard it like treasure. A single drop rubbed into the skin might last for days, fighting back against the reek of sweat and smoke. But more often than not, substitutes were used. Vinegar was the most common. Cheap, sharp and easy to get, it burned across the skin when rubbed in, leaving behind a sour tang that at least overpowered the musty smell of unwashed bodies. Some women even gargled it, thinking it kept their breath fresher. Imagine leaning in to kiss someone and being hit with the sting of vinegar. Better than rotten teeth and stale ale maybe, but not by much. And then there was urine. As revolting as it sounds, aged urine was believed to have cleansing properties. It was already used in laundries, where fullers stomped in vats of urine to whiten cloth. Prostitutes sometimes mimicked this cleaning method on their own bodies. They would soak cloths in it, rub it over their arms or legs, and let the ammonia do its work. The smell, of course, was undeniable, but in a world already stinking of chamber pots, it blended in. A man stumbling in from the street might not even notice, or worse, he might expect it. Herbs provided another layer. Strong-smelling plants like sage, rosemary, or thyme could be crushed and rubbed into the skin, masking the body's musk with something sharp and earthy. Sometimes sprigs of herbs were pinned into hair or tucked into dresses, little bundles meant to give off whiffs of freshness when the rest of the body was anything but. But herbs were expensive too, and not always easy to find in dirty city streets. Often prostitutes used what they could scavenge, weeds, dried flowers, or powders ground from bark. Powders were common, flour dusted over oily hair, chalk smeared on the scalp to hide lice, or ground orris root pressed into the skin to give off a faint floral note. But powders caked quickly, turning pasty when sweat soaked through, leaving streaks on the neck and arms. A woman might begin her night looking powdered and sweet, but by the end of her shift, the powder had melted into muddy streaks that made her look, and smell, worse. Then came smoke. Some women would burn herbs in the room, letting the fumes swirl through the rafters. This wasn't just to improve the air. Smoke also numbed the smell of unwashed bodies and distracted clients long enough for business to be done. But with oil lamps already choking the room, adding more smoke only made the air thicker, harder to breathe. Imagine coughing your way through an encounter while the smell of singed thyme mixes with sweat, vinegar and mildew. And yet, this was considered effort. This was presentation. A prostitute who at least smelled of vinegar or herbs was thought of as trying. Men drunk and desperate might even find comfort in the familiarity of it. After all, they weren't clean themselves. The brothel wasn't a palace, it was a pit. Covering filth with filth was the closest thing to glamour medieval prostitution had. So the next time you imagine medieval perfume, don't think of roses or lavender gardens. Think of vinegar rubbed into sores. Think of flour clumping in sweaty hair. Think of urine-soaked cloths leaving streaks on arms. That was the real scent of medieval brothels. Sharp, sour, pungent, and unforgettable. If you spent even one night in a medieval brothel, odds are you didn't just leave with an empty coin purse. You left with something crawling under your skin, rotting in your veins, or festering between your teeth. For prostitutes, disease was not an occasional danger. It was the constant backdrop of life. Every breath, every scratch, every cough in the dark carried the potential for something that could maim or kill. Let's start with parasites, the ones you couldn't escape. Fleas lived in the straw mattresses, biting everyone who lay down. They spread more than discomfort. Fleas carried the plague. And though not every outbreak was as catastrophic as the Black Death, small waves of infection rolled through towns constantly. Prostitutes, who saw dozens of men a week, became unwilling conduits for these pests. Then came lice. They hid in hair, tunics and bedding. Everyone itched, everyone scratched until they bled. Women rubbed ashes or vinegar into their scalps to kill them, but nothing truly worked. Some even shaved their heads entirely, wearing cloth caps or wigs to hide the baldness. But wigs themselves became infested. It was an endless cycle. Scratch, bleed, infect, repeat. And the worst? Worms. Stomach parasites thrived in an age with no proper sanitation. Prostitutes, forced to eat whatever scraps they could afford, often swallowed tainted meat or spoiled grain. Their bellies swelled, they doubled over in pain, and yet they still had to keep working. Clients didn't care. As long as the woman could smile and endure, the parasites writhing inside her body remained her own problem. Then came the diseases that were harder to ignore. Long before doctors gave it a name, syphilis was already spreading. Its symptoms were horrifying. Open sores, rashes, hair falling out in clumps, and madness in its final stages. Brothels were breeding grounds. Men infected their wives, wives infected newborns, and the cycle never ended. But syphilis wasn't the only curse. Gonorrhea, though unnamed, was rampant. Burning pain, foul-smelling discharge, and infertility for women. Yet prostitutes had no choice but to endure. They weren't allowed to take a break. Sick or not, diseased or not, they worked until their bodies broke down. And then there were the fevers, sweating sickness, a mysterious medieval plague, struck without warning. A woman could be laughing one moment and drenched in sweat, trembling with fever the next. Within hours she might be dead. No cure, no treatment, just terror. Prostitutes, already weakened by poor diets and constant exposure to sick clients, were easy victims. If you survived one outbreak, another always came. The irony? Prostitutes were sometimes blamed for these very diseases. Authorities accused them of spreading filth, while ignoring the fact that men carried sicknesses from one woman to another. Laws were passed to regulate brothels, but the rules weren't about protecting the women. They were about keeping them working long enough to keep money flowing into city coffers. If a woman became too diseased, she might be thrown out into the streets, left to die in the gutter. Now imagine the scene. You're in a dimly lit room. The woman beside you is powdered, smiling, trying to hide the rash creeping along her arm. She adjusts her hair, but a few lice scuttle across her scalp. The blanket itches against your skin, and when you shift, fleas bite your ankles. Somewhere outside, a man coughs a deep, rattling cough that won't stop. The air is heavy with smoke, sweat and sickness. You know you're leaving with more than you came for, and so does she. For prostitutes, hygiene wasn't about staying clean. It was about trying to look alive long enough to earn another coin, even as disease ate them from the inside. Medieval society loved to pretend it hated prostitution, but at the same time, it relied on it. Cities taxed brothels, officials licensed women, and priests thundered against them while sneaking through the doors at night. And when disease began spreading too obviously, the blame fell squarely on the women themselves. The result? Forced inspections, public humiliations dressed up as health measures. In many towns, prostitutes were marched to designated houses where a so-called physician, usually a barber surgeon, with more experience pulling teeth than examining women, would look them over. The goal was to check for visible sores, rashes, or signs of disease. The reality was a parade of shame. Women stripped, poked, prodded, sometimes in front of multiple men, while clients who carried the same diseases walked away untouched. If a woman was found unclean, she might be banned from working for weeks, thrown into a makeshift hospital, or more often, dumped into the streets to fend for herself. But the inspections were inconsistent, brutal, and often cruel. In some places, women were forced to wash in vinegar baths as part of the check, their skin stinging raw. In others, they were made to drink concoctions of herbs, urine, and wine, believed to purify the body from within. None of this cured anything, but it satisfied officials who wanted to be seen doing something. And of course it gave them another excuse to control and humiliate women. Some cities even marked prostitutes publicly. In England, certain towns forced them to wear striped hoods or belts so people knew who they were. In Italy, they might be ordered to live in separate districts or wear brightly coloured clothing to signal their status. For women already struggling to hide their profession from neighbours or family, this was another layer of degradation. Imagine trying to walk through a crowded marketplace with a hood that screamed your identity to everyone around you. Baker, priest, child. No anonymity, no dignity. And let's not forget the economic motive. Inspections weren't free. Women were often charged fees for the privilege of being humiliated. Fines piled up quickly, and if you couldn't pay, you risked jail or whipping. In some cases, the city took part of your earnings directly, claiming it was to fund the hospitals that were supposed to treat diseased women. But hospitals themselves were little more than warehouses for the dying, overcrowded, filthy, and crawling with vermin. Now think of the power imbalance. A drunken merchant could infect half a brothel and face no consequences. But the women he visited would be rounded up, examined, and punished. Prostitutes knew this, and some tried to game the system. They rubbed powders over sores, painted their lips with red ochre to hide scabs, or wore heavier layers of clothing during inspections to conceal rashes. It sometimes worked, but inspectors weren't fools. If you resisted too much, they assumed guilt and punished harder. It's worth remembering that these health checks weren't about safety, they were about control. Cities feared prostitutes, spreading disease to respectable men, the same men who kept their economies alive. By shaming women, officials reassured husbands, priests, and noblemen that the problem was being managed. Meanwhile, nothing changed. The same lice, the same sores, the same infections lingered in every straw mattress across town. Imagine it for yourself. You've been dragged into a cold stone room, your dress stripped off in front of strangers. A man with dirty hands examines you roughly, his face expressionless. Behind you, other women wait their turn, whispering nervously. You know that if he finds anything, your livelihood is gone. Maybe even your life. The shame burns hotter than the vinegar on your skin. That was medieval public health for prostitutes. Humiliation masquerading as medicine. When filth couldn't be scrubbed away, the only option left was to cover it up. In medieval brothels, makeup wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Women used powders, paints, and strange concoctions to disguise sores, dull complexions, or the deep exhaustion carved into their faces. But the cosmetics of the time weren't safe. They were dangerous, caustic, and often as damaging as the diseases they tried to hide. White skin was prized, a symbol of refinement and delicacy, but prostitutes rarely had it naturally. Sun exposure, malnutrition, and endless work left their skin mottled and darkened. To fake paleness, women dusted their faces with powders, chalk, crushed alabaster, or ground bones. In wealthier houses, the dangerous favourite was lead-based ceruse, smooth, white and long-lasting. It gave the illusion of flawless skin. But lead seeped into the pores, poisoning the body slowly. Over time, it caused hair loss, rotting teeth, and even death. The cruel irony: the very paint that made a woman desirable was destroying her beneath the surface. Rouge was another staple. Red ochre or cinnabar was smeared across cheeks and lips to simulate health. The brighter the colour, the better, no matter that cinnabar contained mercury, another slow killer. Prostitutes might smile with painted lips, but beneath the surface their gums bled, their teeth loosened, and their breath reeked of decay. Some tried plant-based alternatives, crushed berries or herbs, but those faded quickly under sweat and candlelight. A night's work required constant reapplication, smearing colour over powder until faces looked like cracked masks, and the eyes, medieval beauty favoured large, bright, shining eyes. To achieve the effect, women used drops of belladonna, literally beautiful lady, made from deadly nightshade. A few drops dilated the pupils, making the gaze look alluring. But belladonna blurred vision, caused hallucinations, and sometimes killed the user outright. Imagine stumbling through a brothel, pupils wide, seeing shapes twist and shimmer, while men mistook the look for seduction. Hair was another battlefield. Lice infested wigs and scalps, so prostitutes dusted their heads with flour, ash or arsenic powders to hide the infestation. Some even bleached hair with lime water or lye, stripping it raw to achieve fashionable shades. The result was brittle strands snapping in clumps, leaving bald patches. Wigs were no relief. They itched, stank, and carried more lice than natural hair. Women hid the damage with scarves or veils, turning decay into an accessory. Perfumed oils were smeared over skin to add shine and mask odour, but these oils were often rancid animal fats mixed with herbs. The shine glistened in lamplight, but the smell lingered. Half rosemary, half rotting meat. Clients either didn't notice or didn't care. In a world where no one bathed regularly, less foul was as good as fragrant. The tragic part was how little choice these women had. Without makeup, sores and disease gave them away, costing them clients. With makeup, they slowly poisoned themselves, layer by layer. Painted skin cracked in the cold, melted in the heat, and left streaks across bedding. Some women even died young from mercury and lead exposure, their beauty literally killing them. Now picture it. You're sitting in a brothel lit by smoky lamps. Across from you, a woman smiles. Her cheeks are bright red, her skin ghostly pale, her lips shining. But up close, the paint cracks like dried clay. Her hair smells faintly of ashes, her eyes are too wide, too glassy. For a moment you wonder, is she trying to look alive, or is she already halfway to death? That was the truth of medieval cosmetics, masks painted over suffering, poison sold as beauty, survival painted on with a shaky hand. Night after night, bathing. Today it's simple. Step into a shower, turn a knob, hot water runs, soap lathers, you're clean. For medieval prostitutes, bathing was neither simple nor regular. It was expensive, dangerous, and in many cases impossible. Clean water was rare, soap harsher than sandpaper, and public baths, the so-called stews, were cesspools of disease and sex. In many towns, the average prostitute might only wash properly once every few weeks, sometimes once a month. Water had to be fetched from wells or rivers, carried by bucket and heated over fire. That much labour wasn't worth it for women working every night. Instead, they relied on quick wipe-downs, cloths dipped in vinegar or wine, rubbed under the arms, between the legs, across the face. It didn't clean, it only masked, dirt and sweat layered over time, sticking like a second skin. Soap, when it was used, wasn't gentle. It was made from animal fat boiled with lye. Caustic stinging, it left skin raw and cracked. For prostitutes with already fragile health, overwashing could be as dangerous as not washing at all. So most skipped it. Better to stink than to peel. The alternative was the bathhouse. Medieval cities teemed with stews, public bathhouses where men and women bathed together, talked, gambled, and more often than not, had sex. Prostitutes worked there openly. Sometimes they bathed with clients, scrubbing each other in warm water scented faintly with herbs. But the water was reused, cloudy with filth, floating with hair, oil, and worse. Disease thrived in these tubs. A single bath might expose you to lice, scabies, or infections far nastier. And yet the bathhouse had a lure. For a few copper coins, a prostitute could at least sit in warm water and feel human again. Records tell us that some women soaked herbs in their bath to fight odour. Rosemary, lavender, if they could afford it, even juniper berries. Others poured in vinegar, believing it purified. Still, the illusion lasted only until the next client. By nightfall, sweat and stink returned, undoing everything. But then came the backlash. By the late Middle Ages, the church grew hostile toward bathhouses, branding them dens of sin. Priests preached that naked bodies together encouraged lust, and when plague swept through Europe, people blamed stews for spreading it. Many bathhouses were shut down. For prostitutes, that meant one less chance to wash. They were forced back to the bucket and cloth, wiping grime in cold corners instead of soaking in warm water. And the irony? Men complained constantly about prostitutes' smell while rarely bathing themselves. Husbands stank of horse sweat, beer and manure, but when they visited brothels, they expected women to smell sweet. To meet that demand, prostitutes doubled down on perfume tricks. Vinegar rubs, urine washes, herbal smokes. They scrubbed themselves raw with linen rags, sometimes until they bled. Cleanliness wasn't about health. It was about staying marketable. Imagine it. You lower yourself into a wooden tub, steam rising in the dim lamplight. Across from you, another woman slips in, her skin slick with oil, sores hidden under powder. The water is already cloudy, sour with vinegar and sweat. You know it's crawling with disease, but for a moment it feels like luxury. Warmth wraps around your bones, the first comfort in weeks. Then the door creaks, a man lumbers in, and the bath turns back into business. That was the water problem for medieval prostitutes. Clean only when paid for, dirty always, survival measured in buckets and baths too foul to heal. If you think hygiene is just about bathing, think again. For medieval prostitutes, clothing was as much of a trap as the lice-filled mattresses they slept on. Clothes soaked up sweat, smoke, and bodily fluids. Washing them was a luxury most couldn't afford, and so garments often stank worse than the bodies inside them. A prostitute's dress wasn't silk or velvet. It was cheap wool or coarse linen, worn threadbare from constant use. She couldn't afford to change outfits every night. Often she owned just one or two dresses, her working gown, and something slightly plainer for the street. Both absorbed filth quickly. smoke from lamps, unwashed sheets, client after client pressing against her. Soon the fabric itself carried a sour odour that no amount of perfume could mask. And laundry. Forget laundromats, or even daily washing. Soap was expensive and scarce, buckets heavy, water filthy. Women dragged garments to streams or communal washhouses when they could, scrubbing them against stones with lye soap that burned skin. But prostitutes rarely had the time or money. Many simply shook out their clothes, hung them near a fire to dry the sweat, and wore them again. Bedding was worse. Straw mattresses crawled with fleas and lice, never fully changed. Sheets were stained with sweat, blood, and worse. Prostitutes sometimes sprinkled herbs or ashes on bedding to hide the smell, but the pests remained. Clients carried infestations home to wives. Wives scratched until they bled, and the cycle spread outward. Authorities tried to regulate clothing as much as they did bodies. In some cities, prostitutes were required to wear distinctive garments: red hoods, striped cloaks, yellow scarves. The idea was to make them recognisable in public, but the reality was constant humiliation. Imagine having to wear a scarlet hood through a crowded marketplace, every glance reminding you of your profession. Worse, the designated colours meant your clothes had to be replaced or dyed, adding another expense you couldn't afford. Some women disobeyed, disguising themselves in plainer garb, risking fines and beatings if caught. And there were the tricks. Some prostitutes rubbed dresses with rosemary or thyme to cover the stink. Others burned incense in small clay pots beneath their skirts to create the illusion of fragrance. Still others brushed fabric with powders made of chalk or ash, giving it a faint sheen under lamplight, even if the cloth itself was crawling with vermin. These desperate hacks might fool a drunken client, but anyone sober enough could smell the truth. Imagine pulling a gown over your head, the fabric stiff with old sweat. It clings to your skin, itchy with fleas, heavy with unwashed filth. The seams scratch, the wool smells faintly of mould, and when you move, the stench rises in waves. You tug at the hem, force a smile, and step into the candlelit room. The client doesn't see the dirt, or doesn't care. To him, you're nothing but a silhouette in the dim light. Laundry, when it happened, wasn't the relief you'd expect. Women hunched over basins, knuckles raw, scrubbing in icy water until their hands cracked. They wrung out heavy garments, hung them in smoky rooms, and waited days for them to dry. By the time they wore the clothes again, they already smelled of fire and mildew. Cleanliness never lasted. For prostitutes, clothing wasn't protection, it was a prison. Every thread soaked up shame, disease, and sweat, and no wash could ever scrub it clean. If there's one thing that rarely makes it into romantic paintings of the Middle Ages, it's the smell of someone's mouth. For prostitutes, bad breath wasn't just common, it was unavoidable. Dental hygiene in the medieval world was crude at best. And for women working nightly, with dozens of men, their mouths became another battlefield in the war against filth. Toothbrushes didn't exist as we know them. At best, people chewed on twigs, rubbed teeth with cloths, or rinsed with vinegar or wine. For prostitutes, these tricks were quick fixes, not cures. The constant diet of cheap bread, salted meat, and wine-rotted teeth from the inside. By their mid-20s, many had blackened stumps instead of pearly smiles. Breath was another horror. Cavities festered, gums oozed, infections spread. In brothels, clients often complained of foul mouths, yet they kept coming back because there weren't many alternatives. Women tried to mask the stench with herbs. They chewed parsley, mint or fennel seeds. Some sucked on cloves or cinnamon sticks, expensive imports that only the luckiest could afford. Others rinsed with wine mixed with ashes, or swished urine, yes urine, believing its ammonia could clean teeth and sweeten breath. It didn't work. At best, the stench was temporarily dulled, replaced with the acrid tang of vinegar or smoke. At worst, the remedies worsened the rot. Wine stripped enamel, ashes scratched teeth down to the pulp, and urine left the mouth burning. Still the rituals continued. Better to smell of vinegar than of decay, at least for an hour. There were even cosmetic cheats. Prostitutes painted lips bright red with ochre or crushed insects to distract from rotten teeth. In dim candle light, the glow of red lips made mouths look enticing. Clients rarely noticed the gaps, the darkened gums, or the loose teeth until they were already too close. And by then, it was too late to back away. But mouth disease wasn't just cosmetic. It could kill. Abscesses swelled, infections spread into the jaw, even into the brain. A prostitute might go to bed with a toothache and never wake up. The pain was relentless and there were no dentists in the modern sense. Extractions were performed by barbers or blacksmiths, often with rusty pliers. Women screamed as teeth were yanked from swollen gums, blood pouring down their throats. No anaesthetic, no sterilisation. Just pain and silence afterward. Clients weren't spared either. Many carried their own dental horrors. Imagine a crowded brothel, air thick with sweat and rot, every kiss an exchange of bacteria, every breath sour. Disease passed mouth to mouth, just as easily as through sex. But while men could walk away and forget, prostitutes carried the constant burden of their own decay. Picture it. You're standing in a dim room, candlelight flickering. A woman leans in, her lips painted, her smile wide. But up close, her teeth are jagged, blackened, a few missing. Her breath hits you, sour wine, smoke, rot. She whispers something, her lips brushing your ear. To you, it's one night. To her, it's another reminder that her body's crumbling faster than her years. That was the reality of medieval sex work. Rotten smiles that no amount of herbs or paint could disguise, and the stench of survival carried in every breath. Step into a medieval brothel, and the first thing that hits you isn't the sight, it's the smell. Forget the faint perfume of roses and candle wax that Hollywood likes to paint. The air inside these places was thick, heavy, and unforgettable. A mix of sweat, stale wine, rotting food, unwashed bodies, cheap incense, and something else you can't quite name. The stench of survival. The rooms were rarely ventilated. Windows, when they existed, were tiny slits stuffed with rags to keep out cold drafts. Fires burned in crude hearths, filling the space with smoke that clung to hair and clothing. The result was a suffocating haze, where every breath felt like inhaling a mix of ash and human musk. Prostitutes lived in this atmosphere every night, their lungs filling with the same soot and stink that clung to their dresses. Sweat was constant. Clients staggered in from taverns, already stinking of ale, garlic, and manure from the streets. Their bodies pressed against women who themselves hadn't bathed in days, whose clothes were sour with old sweat. The heat of too many bodies in too small a space turned the rooms into ovens. Sweat dripped onto straw mattresses, soaked into wooden floors, and fermented into a sour tang that never left. Add to that the smell of disease. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and skin infections left visible sores and oozing wounds. Some clients wore perfume to mask it, but the sickly sweet odour of decay bled through. Prostitutes tried to cover the stench with herbs, burning rosemary, thyme, or juniper in little clay pots. Sometimes they boiled vinegar in pans, believing it purified the air, but nothing could hide the underlying rot. The brothel always smelled like what it was, a place where flesh wore out too quickly. Food contributed its own notes to the bouquet of filth. Leftovers from meals sat rotting in corners, bones chewed clean, tossed onto straw. Bread went mouldy in damp rooms, cheese crawled with maggots, and wine spilled sticky puddles that never fully dried. Rats darted across floors, gnawing at scraps while fleas leapt from their fur onto beds. Clients pretended not to notice, too drunk or too desperate to care. Then there was sex itself. Night after night, bodies collided on the same beds, under the same blankets, without washing. Fluids soaked into sheets and straw, never properly cleaned. Women poured vinegar over bedding or sprinkled ashes to hide the smell, but it lingered. A sharp, sour odour that clung to the air long after the act was done. Even the walls absorbed it. Brothels reeked of centuries of use, every stone sweating with the ghost of 1,000 encounters. Imagine standing there now. The air is so thick you could almost chew it. Smoke scratches your throat. Sweat stings your nose. Incense pricks at your eyes. Somewhere nearby, a man coughs, deep and wet, while another laughs too loudly, drunk on sour ale. A woman walks past, her dress brushing your arm, and you catch the acrid blend of vinegar, powder, and unwashed wool. You swallow, but the taste in your mouth is just more of the same. Foul, bitter, overwhelming. This wasn't romance. This was the daily atmosphere of work, a miasma of dirt and desire so powerful that even those who survived it never forgot the smell. For prostitutes, the brothel air was as inescapable as hunger, a reminder every breath that their world was built on sweat, smoke, and sickness. If you think medieval prostitutes only struggled with clients, disease, and stench, add another enemy to the list: vermin. Brothels weren't just dens of sex, they were crawling, scratching, biting ecosystems of lice, fleas, and rats. Every night was a battle against creatures that thrived in filth, and no one ever truly won. Start with lice. They lived in hair, in pubic regions, in the seams of clothes. Prostitutes shaved sometimes, not for fashion, but as defence. Monks even wrote about it, that fallen women often cut away hair to deny the lice their feast. Still, the bugs always came back. Lice caused constant itching, red welts, and infected sores. Women scratched until they bled, then painted powder or ashes into wounds just to keep working. Clients complained but didn't stop coming. Many carried lice themselves, spreading them like currency. Then there were fleas. Beds stuffed with straw became flea hotels. Each night, women crawled into mattresses that jumped with life. Fleas bit ankles, thighs, bellies, everywhere. They spread plague in waves across Europe. But in a brothel, they simply spread misery. Prostitutes sprinkled their bedding with herbs or ashes to try and repel them. Some even set out bowls of water under bedposts, hoping fleas would drown. It barely worked. Fleas feasted freely, leaving trails of itchy welts that women covered with chalk powder before clients arrived. Rats were worse. Brothels doubled as taverns, kitchens, and boarding houses. Food scraps piled up, ale spilled across floors, bread went mouldy in corners, rats came in droves, squeaking in rafters, darting across straw, gnawing through walls. At night, women sometimes woke to find rats on their bodies, nibbling at crumbs or sores. Chroniclers described rats bold enough to steal bread straight from sleeping mouths. The line between vermin and people blurred, all survived off the same scraps. And rats brought more than fear. They carried fleas, and fleas carried plague. In times of outbreak, prostitutes became scapegoats, accused of spreading pestilence because of their dirty beds. Authorities sometimes burned entire brothels down, blaming women instead of the vermin that infested every building in the city. Prostitutes lost homes, possessions, and what little safety they had, not because of sin, but because of rats. Imagine this. You're lying on a straw mattress after a long night. The straw pricks your skin. Fleas hop across your thighs. You scratch until your nails are filthy, raw. A rat skitters over the rafters, then drops onto the floor with a thud. It noses through your dress, sniffing for crumbs. You swat it away, but another darts across the bed. The scratching and squeaking never stop, not until dawn. By morning you're exhausted, bitten, itching, but you rise anyway. Clients don't care if you've been chewed by vermin. They expect you to smile. Even attempts at control were grotesque. Some brothels fumigated with sulphur smoke, choking prostitutes alongside vermin. Others spread mercury ointments on skin to kill lice, poisoning the women slowly. Herbal charms were hung in doorways, but they wilted within days. Nothing could stop the infestations. Vermin were as much a part of brothels as candles and straw. To be a prostitute in medieval times was to share your body not just with men, but with creatures that gnawed, bit and burrowed. Clients came and went. Lice, fleas and rats stayed forever. When filth was inescapable, the only option was disguise. Prostitutes in the Middle Ages learned to live with lice, fleas and sores, but they also learned how to mask them. The brothel was a theatre, and every night required costume, scent and illusion. And behind the candlelight, the reality was far dirtier than the performance. Perfume was the most obvious trick, but it was rarely real perfume. Only the wealthiest courtesans had access to imported oils of rose, jasmine or musk. The average street prostitute used whatever was available. Crushed herbs rubbed into hair, rosemary stuffed into bodices, lavender tied in little sachets and hung around the neck. Cheap tavern girls sometimes smeared themselves with mint or fennel leaves, hoping the sharp smell would overpower sweat. Others burned incense in the corner of a room, letting smoke roll through the air until clients confused haze for luxury. But perfumes couldn't hide everything. In fact, the mixture of scents often made things worse. Imagine the smell of unwashed bodies layered with vinegar, smoke, and wilted herbs. A pungent cocktail that stung the eyes and clogged the throat. Yet in candlelight, under the sway of drink, clients convinced themselves it was exotic. Smoke itself became a weapon. Prostitutes deliberately filled rooms with thick haze from torches, tallow lamps, or censers burning juniper. Smoke blurred floors, dimmed blemishes, and dulled smells. A man too drunk to stand straight could be convinced the room smelled of incense instead of sweat. In reality, he was choking on the same smoke that blackened lungs and clung to skin for days. Cosmetic tricks were even stranger. Women powdered their faces with ground chalk or flour, creating a pale mask that hid sores and dirt. Some rubbed red ochre on cheeks and lips, a vivid distraction from rotting teeth. Others blackened eyebrows with soot or rubbed egg whites onto skin to give it a false sheen. These masks cracked quickly in the heat of the room, but they lasted just long enough. And then there were the desperate hacks. Some prostitutes rubbed vinegar onto their bodies, believing the sharp sting disguised odours. Others bathed in wine, not to cleanse but to mask filth with a new scent. One chronicler even recorded women soaking cloths in urine, drying them, then wearing them under gowns as a cleaner smell. Ammonia cut through the stench of sweat, though it carried its own choking bite. Clients weren't fooled forever. Many wrote of stinking whores in letters and sermons, complaining that their disguises only magnified the dirt, but they still came back. The illusion didn't need to last long, only until the transaction was done. Imagine stepping into one of those rooms. Smoke curls around you, candles flicker in thick air. A woman approaches, her cheeks bright with crushed brick, her lips painted red. You catch a whiff of rosemary from her bodice, then vinegar, then something sourer beneath. She smiles, but the mask is already cracking, powder flaking, sweat breaking through, smell rising sharp and undeniable. For a moment, you see both illusions at once, the painted courtesan and the exhausted woman beneath, worn down by filth and survival. Perfume and smoke were not about beauty. They were weapons, shields, lies wrapped in herbs and powder. For medieval prostitutes, hiding the stink was as much a part of the job as the act itself. When you picture a prostitute freshening up in medieval times, erase any thought of steaming tubs filled with rose petals. Baths were rare, filthy, and more performance than hygiene. In brothels, bathing was often part of the act, but the reality was as dirty as the work itself. Water was a problem from the start. Clean water wasn't easy to find in crowded towns. Wells were polluted by sewage pits, streams ran brown with waste, and even rain barrels grew algae and worms. When brothels offered baths, they reused the same water for client after client. Imagine a wooden tub filled in the morning, heated once with hot stones, then used by a dozen men and women before nightfall. By evening, the water was cloudy with sweat, dirt, hair, and worse. Prostitutes had little choice. They sat in the murk pretending at luxury, while trying not to gag at the oily film that clung to skin. Soap existed, but it was harsh lye that burned the flesh. Most relied instead on sand or ashes rubbed into skin, scratching away filth, but leaving it raw. Some sprinkled rosemary or mint into the water to mask the smell. But by the second or third bather, the herbs sank to the bottom, useless. And still men believed it was decadent. Bathhouses advertised the sensual image of a woman pouring water over her breasts, steam rising in candlelight. The truth was, women shivering in lukewarm slime, praying the rats didn't scurry too close, while men laughed and splashed in the same dirty tub. For prostitutes, the bath was just another stage, another mask. The water itself carried risks. Skin infections spread easily. Open sores soaked in germs. Lice floated to the surface. Fleas leapt from body to body. Some women left the bath sicker than they entered, their skin burning with rashes or their eyes red with infection. Chroniclers wrote of bathhouses as breeding grounds for plague, yet clients demanded the illusion of cleanliness. And for women, there was no escape. Some were ordered to bathe before clients, whether or not there was water left. Others were scrubbed by attendants like livestock, their skin rubbed raw with brushes. Prostitutes themselves sometimes refused to bathe in public, afraid of being mocked for scars, sores, or deformities. But refusal wasn't an option for long. A woman who didn't refresh risked losing what little income she had. Picture it, a flickering bathhouse, dimly lit, humid and rank. A tub filled with cloudy water sits in the corner, steam rising weakly. A prostitute steps in, her face calm, her lips painted, but beneath the mask she feels the water closing around her thighs like a swamp, the smell of mildew rising. She lowers herself, wincing as the tepid liquid seeps into cuts and sores. Men laugh, splash, demand she smile, and she does because the illusion must hold. Baths were supposed to be about cleansing. For prostitutes in medieval times, they were another form of filth, another layer of performance in a world where dirt always won. If dirt was inescapable in a medieval brothel, disease was inevitable. Prostitutes didn't just work in filth. They carried it in their bodies, lived with it, and often died from it. No amount of vinegar rinses, herb sachets, or smoky disguises could protect them from the reality of infection. Syphilis and gonorrhea spread like wildfire through towns, leaving sores, fevers, and sterility in their wake. Prostitutes were the first to feel it, the first to be blamed, and the last to be helped. Physicians had no cure, only cruel treatments. Mercury ointments burned skin raw. Mercury vapours were inhaled, rotting teeth and poisoning organs. The saying went, a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury. For prostitutes, that was often literal, their bodies bearing the scars of both the disease and the supposed cure, but the infections didn't stop there. Tuberculosis thrived in crowded brothels. Women coughed blood into rags, wiped their mouths, and returned to work. Typhus followed fleas in the straw beds. Dysentery came from spoiled food and dirty water. Skin infections, eye inflammations, rashes that never healed, all part of the daily cost. The human body was both workplace and battlefield, and survival meant pushing through constant pain. Society, of course, blamed the women. Prostitutes were called plague bearers, accused of spreading disease to husbands and soldiers. In some cities, they were forced to wear special clothing, like yellow veils, marking them as dirty and untouchable. Some were locked in hospitals or leper houses when symptoms became too obvious. Many died there, nameless and forgotten. But the truth was simpler, crueler. It wasn't prostitutes who created disease, and it was the conditions of medieval life itself. Dirty water, poor food, vermin, lack of hygiene. Men brought infections to brothels as much as they carried them out. Yet women carried the stigma. Their bodies became symbols of corruption, when in reality they were the ones forced to endure it most. And still, they worked, because hunger was stronger than shame. A prostitute with sores on her legs still stood in the doorway. One with a cough still took clients in smoky rooms. One with lice still powdered her hair with flour and smiled. They had no choice. Disease wasn't just an occupational hazard, it was the occupation. Imagine yourself in that world one last time. The brothel air heavy with sweat and smoke. The mattress itching with fleas. A woman beside you smiles, but her breath is sour with infection. She laughs, but her hand trembles, her nails broken, her skin marked with sores. She leans closer, and for a moment you see not a seductress, but a survivor, fighting for life in a place that gives nothing back. This is the part polite history avoids. The dirt, the disease, the desperate disguises. People prefer the fantasy, lace, laughter, candlelight. But the truth is darker. For prostitutes in the Middle Ages, hygiene wasn't just bad. It was a daily battlefield where no one won. Brothels weren't just full of sweat and straw. They were drowning in waste. Imagine dozens of women, dozens more clients, all eating, drinking, sweating, relieving themselves under one roof. There were no modern toilets, no sewage pipes. The chamber pot was king, and it overflowed. Every prostitute had one in her room, a clay or wooden vessel where she and her clients relieved themselves. By dawn the pot reeked, heavy with urine and feces. Some women emptied them down stairwells, others hurled them straight into the gutter outside. Chroniclers describe midnight rivers of waste pouring from windows, splashing onto the streets below. Passing pedestrians cursed, but nothing changed. The smell clung to everything. Rooms stank of stale urine, mattresses soaked up spills, floors became sticky with layers of filth. Women worked in those rooms anyway, lighting candles, sprinkling herbs, pretending at charm while the stench seeped from corners. Sometimes chamber pots cracked or tipped, soaking bedding. Prostitutes slept inches from the mess, coughing in the fumes. Authorities occasionally cracked down, fining brothel keepers for filth. But most turned a blind eye, happy to collect taxes. Prostitutes bore the burden, cleaning pots between clients, holding rags to noses, pretending not to gag. Waste was part of the job, as unavoidable as fleas or sores. And so the chamber pot problem lingered. Prostitutes not only sold their bodies, they sold them in rooms that stank of waste, in buildings where chamber pots lined hallways, like ticking bombs. Hygiene wasn't just disgusting, it was impossible. What you ate in a brothel could kill you almost as surely as the work. Prostitution was often tied to taverns. Ale flowed endlessly, bread and stews were served to clients, and prostitutes ate scraps left behind. But the food was as filthy as the rooms. Bread was black with mould, full of grit from grinding stones that broke teeth. Stews were thin, made from scraps of meat already turning sour. Prostitute kitchens were famous for reusing broth, day after day, tossing new bones into old pots until the liquid reeked. Fish stank from sitting too long in barrels, salted beyond recognition. Ale, the drink of choice, wasn't clean either. Brewed in unsanitary conditions, it soured quickly, crawling with bacteria. Prostitutes drank it because water was worse, often drawn from streams polluted with feces. Wine was expensive, so brothels watered it down, disguising the rot with herbs. Women ate fast, often standing between clients, swallowing whatever scraps were left. Malnutrition followed. Many prostitutes had rotting teeth, swollen gums, and thin, brittle hair from poor diets. Some tried to mask bad breath with cloves or parsley, but few could afford it. Clients joked about the food, but prostitutes had no choice. Hunger gnawed harder than shame. So they ate mouldy bread, sour ale, rancid meat. Their bodies, as filthy as their work was, prostitutes carried an extra burden, the constant weight of religious shame. Priests thundered from pulpits about their sins, calling them disease-ridden, cursed, damned. But sermons weren't enough. Cities turned humiliation into public spectacle. In some towns, prostitutes were forced to wear special clothes, yellow veils in Italy, striped cloaks in France, bells on their shoes in parts of Germany. These marks branded them as dirty, untouchable, less than human. Clients laughed at the hypocrisy. Men who spent the night with prostitutes mocked them in daylight. Punishments were creative. Women caught outside designated brothel streets were whipped in marketplaces. Some had their heads shaved, their hair hung on city gates as warning. Others were locked in pillories, jeered at by crowds, pelted with rotten food and dung. Prostitutes endured it because they had no choice. Fined, beaten, humiliated, then sent back to work. And still the church profited. Monasteries and bishops collected taxes from brothels, calling it a necessary evil. Prostitutes bore the shame, the lash, the filth, while men in robes pocketed coins. Hygiene wasn't just about dirt, it was about moral dirtiness written on their bodies like a brand. For prostitutes, even death wasn't clean. When women died, from disease, violence, or sheer exhaustion, they rarely received proper burial. Churches often refused to accept their bodies, branding them unclean. Many were dumped into mass graves outside city walls, buried without names or prayers. Chroniclers described corpses found in alleys near brothels, wrapped in rags, gnawed by dogs. Sometimes brothel owners quietly disposed of the dead at night, dragging bodies to rivers or pits. Other times, prostitutes' friends carried them, weeping, to unconsecrated ground. Their graves marked only by stones or not at all. Death revealed the full weight of stigma. Women who had entertained nobles, soldiers, even priests, were abandoned in death like trash. Their bodies carried sores, lice, the smell of sickness. No one wanted them near hallowed earth, and yet, in the shadows, some women performed their own rites. Prostitutes prayed over the bodies of their sisters, whispered blessings, placed flowers or coins in cold hands. These small acts of dignity stood against a society that saw them as nothing more than filth. In life, prostitutes lived in dirt. In death they were returned to it, the final, unforgiving hygiene of the Middle Ages. When we look back at the Middle Ages, most people imagine castles and knights, kings and queens, or plague sweeping across Europe. Rarely does anyone picture the narrow alleyways that smelled of urine, or the brothels where women worked in rooms crawling with lice, or the chamber pots dumped into gutters. Yet for countless women, this was daily life. And for prostitutes, it was worse. Their existence was built on filth, physical filth, moral filth, and the filth others projected onto them. They endured beds alive with vermin, chamber pots that stank of sickness, water that spread more disease than it washed away. They painted their faces with powders made from lead, rubbed herbs into their skin to disguise rot, and lit candles to mask the smell of sweat. But none of it was enough. Dirt always seeped through. Society called them unclean. Yet those same clean men who spat at them in daylight paid for their company at night. Priests thundered about sin from the pulpit, then collected brothel taxes to fund their churches. Magistrates fined prostitutes for filth, while their own streets flowed with sewage. The hypocrisy stank almost as badly as the brothels themselves. And through it all the women survived. They worked with rotting teeth, bleeding gums, infected sores. They whispered prayers over chamber pots, scrubbed themselves raw with lye, endured humiliation in marketplaces, and carried disease in their bodies. They endured hunger, cold, lice, beatings, shame. They endured because survival gave them no other choice. Picture it one last time. The brothel is dim, the air thick with smoke. A woman sits on a straw mattress, brushing lice from her hair into a bowl. Another scrubs a chamber pot in a corner, gagging at the smell. Outside, the gutter runs with sewage, pigs rooting in the muck. A man pushes open the door, grinning, coins in hand. The women rise, straighten their clothes, put on their painted masks. For a moment, they smile, as if filth can be forgotten, but it lingers in the air, on their skin, in their lungs, always. That is the part history tried to forget, the part no one wants to write about in glowing manuscripts or romantic legends. Prostitutes in the Middle Ages weren't just working girls. They were survivors in a world stacked against them, trapped in filth so deep that even memory tried to wash it away. But dirt, like truth, has a way of clinging. So the next time you hear about knights and tournaments, castles and crusades, remember the women who lived in the shadows of that same world. Women who sold not just their bodies, but their dignity, their health, and often their lives. Women who endured the worst hygiene imaginable, not by choice but by necessity. This is their story. Not polished, not romantic, not clean, but real.